Narcissistic dynamics are often reduced to simple ideas like cruelty, manipulation, or ego. That framing misses the structural nature of what is happening. In many cases, the pattern is not random emotional volatility. It is a consistent system of perception, repetition, and identity enforcement. One useful way to understand this system is through the idea of snapshotting, where a person forms a fixed internal model of another individual and then continues interacting with that model rather than the real, changing human being in front of them. In snapshotting, the other person becomes psychologically frozen. Their complexity is collapsed into a simplified identity, strong or weak, valuable or worthless, dominant or subordinate, competent or incompetent. Once this simplification occurs, new evidence has limited impact. The narcissistic individual does not continuously revise the model based on reality. Instead, they filter reality through the pre-existing image. This creates a stable but distorted internal narrative that resists correction. Once the snapshot is established, communication becomes a reinforcement mechanism. This is where the pattern of what you called signal insults becomes important. These signals are not always overt aggression. They can include tone shifts, selective attention, sarcastic framing, repeated jokes targeting the same trait, comparisons to others, or subtle dismissals that carry emotional weight. On the surface, these may appear fragmented or situational. Structurally, they often point back to the same internal image. The function of the signal is not only expression, it is reinforcement of the snapshot. Over time, repetition creates psychological conditioning. In behavioral psychology, repeated emotional pairing strengthens associative learning pathways. When a person is repeatedly exposed to messages that connect certain traits with shame, rejection, or inferiority, those traits become emotionally sensitized. The nervous system begins to anticipate the pattern. This anticipation is critical. The reaction begins before the explicit signal is even delivered. This is how a person can feel triggered by subtle cues, pauses, or context that resembles previous interactions. At this stage, the experience can shift from external interaction to internal experience. The mind begins to carry an echo of the repeated message. Even in the absence of the narcissistic individual, the internal representation of their voice can activate automatically. This is where object relations theory becomes relevant. In the work of Otto Kernberg, pathological relational patterns often involve rigid, split internal representations of self and others. These internal objects are not neutral memories. They are emotionally charged structures that can operate semi-independently of conscious thought. Heinz Kohut's self-psychology expands this further by focusing on how the self depends on mirroring relationships. When mirroring is consistent and empathetic, the self becomes cohesive and stable. When mirroring is inconsistent, idealizing, or devaluing, the self can fragment or become overly dependent on external validation. In a narcissistic relational dynamic, mirroring is often replaced with conditional recognition. The target is seen clearly only when they fit the assigned role. When they deviate, recognition shifts into criticism or withdrawal. This creates instability in self-perception. The individual may begin to rely on the narcissist's feedback as a reference point for identity. Over time, the external evaluation system becomes internalized. This is where the concept of internal objects becomes practical rather than theoretical. The narcissist's voice is no longer only external. It becomes a mental structure that can generate self-criticism automatically. The idea of metrics plays a central role in this process. Narcissistic evaluation often depends on narrowing the definition of human value into a limited set of criteria. These criteria are not neutral. They are selected based on what reinforces the narcissist's superiority or control. Common metrics include financial status, social dominance, physical appearance, obedience, or perceived competence. Other dimensions of human value, such as integrity, resilience, creativity, empathy, or spiritual depth, are minimized or ignored if they do not serve the imposed hierarchy. This creates a controlled, evaluative environment. The narcissist effectively defines the scoreboard. Within this framework, the target is measured according to rules they did not choose. The psychological effect is subtle but powerful. The person is not only criticized, they are positioned within a system where criticism feels structurally justified. This is where devaluation becomes more than insult. It becomes a constructed reality with its own internal logic. As repetition continues, sensitization increases. The nervous system becomes tuned to detect threat in specific domains. This is not purely cognitive, it is physiological. Emotional memory strengthens pathways that prioritize speed over accuracy. The brain learns that certain cues predict emotional pain, so it reacts earlier and more intensely. This is why the reaction can feel disproportionate or involuntary. It is the result of learned anticipation rather than present reality. At the same time, the narcissistic individual may unconsciously or consciously refine their signals. If a particular topic produces a strong emotional response, that topic becomes a reliable lever. Over time, interaction becomes organized around these leverage points. The relationship begins to resemble a feedback loop where emotional reactions reinforce future targeting. The more reactive the response, the more precise the targeting becomes. Some interpretations, including those of Sam Vaknin, describe narcissistic relationships as involving interaction with internalized images rather than real individuals. While his framing is controversial and not universally accepted in clinical psychology, it overlaps with the idea of snapshotting. The key concept is rigidity. The narcissistic perception of the other person is resistant to change, even in the face of contradictory evidence. The real person and the internal image diverge further over time. From a relational psychology perspective, this rigidity explains why reassurance or behavioral change from the target often fails to resolve the pattern. The issue is not lack of evidence. It is that the internal model is prioritized over external reality. The narcissist is not updating the map, they are defending it. Eventually, the most significant shift occurs when internalization takes place. The external voice is gradually absorbed into the self-concept of the target. This is not always dramatic or conscious. It can appear as self-doubt, intrusive self-criticism, or automatic evaluation using the same metrics previously imposed externally. The narcissist no longer needs to be present for the system to run. The evaluative structure has been internalized. At this point, the dynamic is no longer purely interpersonal. It becomes intrapsychic. The individual is now navigating both their own perspective and the internalized echo of the other person's judgments. This is where many people experience the deepest confusion, because the criticism feels like it originates from within, even though its structure was formed externally. Breaking this pattern requires more than resisting individual insults. It requires dismantling the authority of the imposed metric system itself. If the scoreboard is accepted as legitimate, the evaluations retain power. If the legitimacy of the scoreboard is questioned, the structure begins to weaken. Psychological integration involves rebuilding self-evaluation around internally chosen values rather than externally imposed rankings. In the frameworks of Kernberg and Kohut, recovery and stability depend on the consolidation of a coherent self that is not overly dependent on external mirroring or split representations. In practical terms, this means re-expanding the definition of worth beyond the narrow metrics imposed in the narcissistic dynamic. It also means recognizing that emotional reactions are often conditioned responses rather than objective truths about the self. Ultimately, snapshotting and signal-based reinforcement are not simply about insults. They are about control of perception through repetition and selective framing. The power of the system depends on three elements working together: a rigid internal image, repeated signaling that reinforces it, and a target who begins to accept the imposed metrics as valid. When any of these elements weaken, the structure destabilizes, the snapshot loses rigidity, the signals lose authority, and the internal echo gradually fades, allowing a more flexible and self-directed sense of identity to re-emerge.